The harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen fixture cast long, unforgiving shadows over the worn oak table. John sat with his heavy shoulders hunched forward, his hands resting on a mountain of final notice bills and medical statements. His hands were a map of a lifetime of hard labor, the knuckles scarred, the skin permanently stained with the dark engine grease of the local mechanic shop where he had worked for 30 years. Across from him stood Martha, a retired school teacher, her eyes red and swollen, staring blankly at the stack of envelopes that threatened to drown them. The crushing weight of their reality was not just financial. The bills were simply the collateral damage of a grief so profound it had hollowed out their very souls. Just 3 weeks ago, 2 men in crisp uniform had knocked on their front door, bringing the kind of news that stops a mother's heart and brings a strong man to his knees. Their only son, Tyler, was gone. Yet resting on top of the pile of debts, completely out of place in that house of mourning, was a pristine envelope containing 2 VIP tickets to see the King of Country Music. It was Tyler's final gift to them, purchased months before his last deployment, a gesture of pure devotion to the parents who had sacrificed everything for him. The transition from the suffocating silence of that small kitchen to the deafening roar of the massive stadium in Arlington, Texas, was jarring. Outside, the brutal summer sun baked the asphalt, radiating waves of heat that distorted the horizon, but inside the colossal indoor arena, the air was cool and electric. 80,000 people had gathered under the steel beams, their voices merging into a single, thunderous entity. The air was thick with the scent of expensive leather boots, spilled draft beer, and the invisible, familiar dust of the Texas plains carried in on the denim of working-class men and women. The energy was palpable, a vibrating force that rattled the ribs and stirred the blood. Every single person in that building was there to witness a living legend, a man who represented the very fabric of their traditional, hard-working lives. On the stage, bathed in blinding white and blue spotlights, stood the man himself. George was the absolute embodiment of the stoic cowboy archetype. He wore his trademark starched plaid shirt, perfectly creased jeans, and a pristine felt Stetson pulled down just low enough to cast a shadow over his calm, observant eyes. He was not a man of cheap theatrics or long, rambling speeches. He was a man of quiet faith, immense wisdom, and profound respect for the people who paid their hard-earned money to hear him sing. His concert was a masterclass in precision, a well-oiled machine where the band anticipated his every breath, delivering classic after classic without missing a single beat. He stood with his acoustic guitar strapped across his chest, his voice rolling through the massive speakers with that smooth, comforting drawl that felt like a long drive down a familiar country road at sunset. Down in the very front row, pressed tightly against the cold steel of the security barricade, stood a figure that sharply contrasted with the sea of plaid and cowboy hats. It was a young man, standing rigidly at attention, wearing the immaculate, striking blue dress uniform of the United States Marine Corps. Corporal Miller did not sing along. He did not hold up a glowing cell phone or scream the artist's name. He stood with the solemnity of a guardian at a sacred tomb. In his left hand, he held a battered, dirt-stained manila envelope, its edges frayed and sealed with thick, olive-drab military tape. The envelope looked as though it had been dragged through the worst corners of the earth, carrying a weight far heavier than the paper it was made of. As we pause in the presence of such profound dedication and the silent struggles of everyday heroes, I want to take a brief moment to gently invite you to become a part of our family. If you value stories of honor, sacrifice, and the deep roots of working-class resilience, please subscribe to our channel, gently press the like button, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. We would also be deeply honored to know where you are joining us from, so please leave a comment with the name of your city. Your presence here helps us keep these vital stories alive, and we thank you kindly for your time. Up on the stage, the transition between 2 upbeat, foot-stomping songs was about to occur. The band was already gearing up, the drummer raising his sticks, the fiddle player positioning his bow. George, who rarely broke his concentration or his sweeping gaze over the distant tiers of the arena, happened to lower his eyes toward the barricade. Through the blinding glare of the footlights, his eyes locked onto the young Marine. It was a fleeting second, but in that fraction of time, A silent, powerful communication passed between the two men. George saw the exhaustion in the young soldier's eyes, the unyielding posture of respect, and the desperate urgency with which he held that battered envelope. The Marine slowly raised his right hand, delivering a crisp, flawless salute, holding it steady while offering the package forward. Decades of rigid stage protocol, the strict timing of the broadcast, the rules of the tour management, all of it vanished from George's mind. Deep down, beneath the fame and the platinum records, he was still a Texas rancher who knew that when a man in uniform stands before you with that look in his eyes, you stop whatever you're doing and you pay attention. Without a word, George raised his right hand, his palm facing the band. The gesture was subtle but carried the absolute authority of a king in his court. The drummer froze. The steel guitar whined into silence. The fiddle player lowered his instrument. The sudden, shocking cessation of music hit the arena like a physical blow. The deafening roar of 80,000 fans fractured into a confused, murmuring ocean of whispers. Backstage, absolute chaos erupted. The stage director's voice barked frantically over the radio headsets, demanding to know if there was a technical failure. Men in black polo shirts with earpieces surged forward from the shadows, their training dictating that any disruption near the stage was a potential threat. The head of security, a massive man with a stern face, rushed toward the barricade, his arm extending to shove the Marine's hand away, assuming the young man was just another overzealous fan trying to hand over a bootleg record or a piece of memorabilia. The tension in the air snapped like a dry twig under a heavy boot. George moved with a deliberate, measured pace toward the edge of the stage. He did not run, but his strides were purposeful. As the security chief grabbed the Marine's wrist, George's voice cut through the murmurs without the aid of the microphone. It was a quiet voice, but it carried the chilling, unquestionable command of a man who tolerated no disrespect. He looked down at the security guard, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his Stetson. He simply shook his head once and quietly told the man to step back and leave the boy alone. The guard, recognizing the absolute resolve in the singer's face, immediately released the soldier and stepped back into the shadows, lowering his head in deference. With the grace of a man who had spent his life in the saddle, George knelt at the edge of the stage. The wood groaned slightly under his weight. He reached out and gently took the battered envelope from the Marine's hand. The paper was rough, stained with the rust-colored dirt of a land far away from the green pastures of Texas. George nodded to the young soldier, a silent promise that the burden was now in his hands. He stood up slowly, walking back to the center of the stage, the spotlight following his every move. He approached the microphone stand, his hands working the heavy military tape. As he pulled the flap open, he reached inside. The entire stadium held its breath. George pulled out a piece of crumpled, lined notebook paper, and tangled within it was a metal chain. As the chain slipped from his fingers, a pair of silver military dog tags swung forward, striking the metal mesh of the microphone. The sharp, cold clink of the metal echoed through the massive speakers, ringing out across the silent stadium like a church bell, tolling in the dead of night. George unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the first few lines. The crowd watched as the broad, strong shoulders of the cowboy seemed to sink under an invisible, crushing weight. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening, as the devastating reality of the words on the page threatened to break his stoic facade. The silence inside the colossal arena was unnatural, a heavy, suffocating blanket that had been thrown over 80,000 souls. In a venue built for deafening cheers and roaring music, the sudden absence of sound was so absolute that the low mechanical hum of the massive air conditioning units high up in the steel rafters became vividly clear. On the giant high-definition screens flanking the stage, the face of the cowboy was magnified for all to see. Every crease near his eyes, earned from decades of squinting into the harsh Texas sun, was visible. The crowd watched as he stared down at the crumpled, dirt-stained paper in his hands. The metal dog tags still rested against the dark mesh of the microphone, a stark, cold reminder of mortality in a place meant for celebration. The band stood frozen behind him, professional musicians who had played thousands of shows, now reduced to silent witnesses, holding their instruments like useless tools. George did not rush. He read the words written on that page, his eyes moving slowly back and forth. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, pressed hard into the cheap paper by a hand that was likely trembling, written in a place far removed from the safety and comfort of an American stadium. With every line he absorbed, the stoic posture of the legendary singer seemed to bear a heavier load. He was a man deeply rooted in his faith, a man who understood the profound, unyielding bond of family and the sacred duty of those who serve. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and for a fleeting moment, he closed his eyes. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he is trying to push back a rising tide of grief. He reached up with a calloused thumb and wiped a single rogue tear that had escaped the shadow of his Stetson. The crowd saw it all. In the front rows, men in starched shirts instinctively reached up and removed their hats, holding them over their hearts. They did not know what the letter said, but they knew the universal language of sorrow and respect. When George finally opened his eyes, the look of quiet reflection had transformed into a gaze of absolute, unshakable resolve. He knew that the rules of the tour, the strict timing of the broadcast, and the expectations of the promoters meant absolutely nothing in the face of what he held in his hands. He made a conscious, deliberate decision. He would not keep this burden to himself. He would not fold the paper, put it in his pocket, and sing another cheerful tune. He stepped closer to the microphone. He gently lifted the dog tags, wrapping the silver chain around his fingers so they would not strike the metal again, treating them with the reverence of a holy relic. He leaned in. The speakers let out a faint electrical hiss before his voice filled the vast expanse of the stadium. It was not the smooth, effortless singing voice that had sold millions of records. It was rough, thick with emotion, and deeply human. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his rich Texas drawl echoing off the concrete walls, wrapping around the audience like a comforting arm. "I have been incredibly blessed in my life. I have stood on stages across this great country for more years than I can count. And over those years, folks have been kind enough to hand me a lot of things. Flowers, letters, old records to sign. I appreciate every single one of them. But I have never, in all my days, been handed something quite like this." He paused, looking down at the young Marine corporal who still stood at rigid attention by the barricade, his eyes fixed firmly on the singer. George offered the young man a slow, respectful nod before turning his gaze back to the endless sea of faces in the dark. "This envelope did not come from the brave young man standing down here in the front," George continued, his voice steadying, finding its strength. "He was just the messenger, carrying out a promise to a brother in arms. This letter and these tags I'm holding belong to a young man born and raised right here in the Lone Star State, out in Midland, a place where the dirt is red, the wind blows hard, and the folks know the true meaning of a hard day's work. His name is Sergeant Tyler Hayes." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath as the reality of the military tags and the dirt-stained envelope began to click into place. In the upper decks, where the shadows were deepest, people began to hold on to each other. George looked down at the letter again, as if drawing courage from the jagged handwriting. 3 weeks ago, in the rocky dust of Helmand Province, Afghanistan, Sergeant Hayes and his platoon were caught in a brutal ambush. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and taking heavy fire. According to the words written here by his commanding officer, Tyler did not hesitate. He laid down, covering fire, exposing himself to the enemy so that his brothers could fall back to safety. He saved his entire unit that day. But, ladies and gentlemen, Tyler did not make it back to the wire. He gave his last full measure of devotion so that others could live. The silence that followed those words was absolute and crushing. 80,000 people stopped breathing. The air in the stadium grew incredibly heavy. Grown men, tough, sun-baked ranchers and oil rig workers bowed their heads, the tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on their cheeks. Women covered their mouths, stifling quiet sobs. It was a collective mourning, a sudden shared realization of the price paid for the freedom to gather in a safe, air-conditioned arena on a Saturday night. "But that is not the only reason I stopped this show," George's voice rang out again, cutting through the heavy grief, rising with a poignant, heartbreaking clarity. "You see, Tyler wrote a letter a few days before that patrol. He gave it to his buddy just in case. But inside this envelope there was something else. Months ago, before he ever shipped out, Tyler saved up his combat pay. He bought 2 VIP tickets to this very concert. It was a surprise gift for his parents for their 35th wedding anniversary. High up in the lower bowl of the stadium in section 114, John and Martha had been sitting in the dark, their hands tightly clasped together. Coming to the concert had been an agonizing decision. The music, the crowds, the joy of the people around them felt like a sharp knife twisting in their fresh wounds. They had felt entirely out of place, 2 ghosts haunting a celebration. John had worn his best work shirt, the one with his name embroidered over the pocket, because it was the shirt he was wearing the day Tyler had left for boot camp. Martha had worn the silver cross necklace Tyler had bought her with his first paycheck. They had come solely to honor their son's final gift, enduring the loud music as a painful tribute to his memory. When the music had suddenly stopped, John had felt a spike of irritation, wishing the distraction would just continue so he wouldn't have to sit alone with his thoughts. But as the cowboy on stage began to speak of Midland, John's heart had started to pound against his ribs like a trapped bird. When the name Tyler Hayes echoed through the stadium, Martha let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream, her hands flying to her face. John gripped her arm, his calloused hands trembling violently, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, terror, and an overwhelming, suffocating grief. He could not comprehend what was happening. How did this legendary man standing under the bright lights know about his boy? How did he have his tags? George looked away from the crowd and turned to the side of the stage, looking directly at the unseen technical crew in the shadows. His voice was no longer just speaking to the audience. It was issuing a gentle but firm command. "House lights down, please," George requested, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Instantly, the ambient lighting in the massive arena faded to pitch black. The jumbotron screens went dark. The only illumination was the single, piercing white spotlight shining down on George, making him look like a solitary beacon in an ocean of darkness. "Lighting crew," George spoke into the quiet, his voice echoing in the cavernous black space. "I need you to find section 114. Row A, seats 1 and 2. The massive motorized spotlights mounted in the steel rafters whirred to life. Thick beams of brilliant white light cut through the dusty air of the stadium, sweeping across the dark sections of the crowd like the searchlights of a rescue helicopter looking for survivors in a stormy sea. The beams moved frantically at first, crossing over thousands of bewildered faces, illuminating rows of empty seats, before finally converging. The heavy beams of light snapped into focus, locking onto the front row of the lower section. They illuminated a small, older couple sitting amidst a sea of darkness. The giant screens flickered back to life, projecting their image to 80,000 people. There sat John, his weathered, grease-stained hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his face pale and frozen in absolute shock. Next to him, Martha was completely undone. She was folded over, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. The light was blinding, intrusive, yet deeply holy. They were no longer anonymous mourners lost in a crowd. They were the focal point of an entire nation's gratitude and sorrow. George looked up toward the section, shielding his eyes from the glare of his own spotlight so he could see them. He stepped away from the microphone stand, pulling the mic with him, walking to the very edge of the stage to be as close to them as physically possible. He looked up at the grieving parents, his expression one of profound, fatherly empathy. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," George said softly, his voice trembling just a fraction, "I hold in my hand the last words your boy ever wrote." And he asked his buddy to make sure, if the worst happened, that this letter found its way to me tonight, so I could read it to you. So you would know, without a shadow of a doubt, what was in his heart. John stared down at the stage, tears finally breaking free from his eyes, tracing the deep lines of his weathered face. He pulled Martha close, wrapping his thick, strong arm around her trembling shoulders, burying his face into her hair as they braced themselves for the voice of their son, delivered through the lips of a stranger. George unfolded the crumpled paper once more. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at the two figures bathed in the light. "Dear Mom and Dad," George read, his voice steadying, carrying the weight of the young soldier's spirit. If you are hearing this, it means I am not sitting in the seat next to you tonight. It means God called me home a little earlier than we planned. I am so sorry for the pain I know you are feeling, but I need you to know that I am not afraid, and I have no regrets." The stadium was so quiet, you could hear the faint rustle of the paper in George's hand. "Mum," George continued, reading Tyler's words, "thank you for every prayer you whispered over my bed, and for teaching me that a man's true strength comes from his compassion. I carried your cross in my pocket every single day, and it brought me peace when the nights were loud and terrifying. And Dad, thank you for teaching me how to turn a wrench, how to look a man in the eye, and how to stand my ground when things get hard. The lessons I learned under the hood of that old Ford in our driveway are the same lessons that kept my brothers alive over here. You taught me how to be a man of my word." John squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving as the memories of those grease-stained afternoons in the driveway washed over him. The smell of oil, the sound of his son's laughter, the proud look on Tyler's face when he finally fixed the carburetor on his own. It was all there, vivid and agonizingly beautiful. "I bought these tickets for you," George read, his voice growing softer, more intimate, "because this man's music was the soundtrack of our family. It was playing on the radio when we drove to church, when we worked in the garage, and when you drove me to the recruiting station. It is the sound of home." George paused, taking a deep breath, preparing for the final lines of the letter. He looked directly into the spotlight hitting John. "George, if you are the one reading this, I have one last favor to ask," the singer read, his own voice cracking slightly. "Please play Amarillo by Morning for my old man. It was the song playing on the radio of his pickup truck the day he taught me how to drive. Let him hear it one more time and let him know his boy is riding in the passenger seat tonight." George slowly lowered the letter. He folded it with meticulous care, tucking it safely into the breast pocket of his shirt, right over his heart. He looked up at John and Martha, who were clinging to each other, completely shattered, yet surrounded by an invisible, overwhelming wave of love from the 80,000 strangers weeping in the dark around them. The king of country music did not say another word. He did not offer empty platitudes or try to fill the silence with chatter. He simply turned his head and looked at his band. He raised his hand and dismissed them. He pointed to the shadows, signaling for them to leave the stage. One by one, the musicians quietly unplugged their instruments and walked off into the darkness, leaving George entirely alone under the bright white light. He unslung his acoustic guitar, bringing it to the front of his body. He adjusted the strap, his fingers resting gently on the strings. The stadium remained in total darkness, save for the beam of light on the grieving parents and the beam of light on the stoic cowboy. George stood entirely alone on the massive stage, a solitary figure anchored by the weight of a promise made by a fallen soldier. The deafening silence of 80,000 people pressing in on him was a testament to the gravity of the moment. He raised his right hand, his calloused thumb resting against the heavy gauge strings of his worn acoustic guitar. When he struck the first chord, the sound did not just fill the air, it pierced the very soul of the stadium. It was raw, unpolished, and devastatingly beautiful. Without the backing of his world-class band, without the soaring whine of the pedal steel or the driving rhythm of the drums, the music was stripped down to its absolute essence. It was just wood, wire, and the weathered voice of a man singing for a ghost. The familiar opening melody of Amarillo by Morning echoed through the cavernous space. It was a song that every person in that arena knew by heart, a rodeo anthem about loss, endurance, and the relentless passage of time. But tonight the lyrics transformed. They were no longer about a weary bull rider traveling the dusty highways of Texas. They became the anthem of a young Marine who had given everything he had on a foreign battlefield. When George sang the words about having a broken leg and losing a wife, the crowd heard the sacrifice of a boy who would never come home to build a life of his own. When he sang that everything he got is just what he had on, the image of Tyler in his combat gear, laying down his life for his brothers, burned into the minds of everyone listening. George closed his eyes as he sang, his voice breaking slightly on the higher notes, stripped of its usual studio perfection. It was the voice of a father mourning a son, the voice of a nation weeping for its lost youth. He did not perform the song. He prayed it. Down in the front row, the young Marine corporal stood frozen, tears streaming freely down his stoic face, pooling at the collar of his pristine blue uniform. He did not wipe them away. He stood at attention, honoring his fallen brother as the acoustic chords washed over him. Up in section 114, John and Martha clung to each other in the blinding beam of the spotlight. John closed his eyes, and the massive stadium around him simply melted away. He was no longer sitting in a plastic seat surrounded by thousands of strangers. He was back in the cab of his beat-up Ford pickup truck, the smell of stale coffee and motor oil in the air. The Texas sun was beating down on the dashboard, and a 16-year-old Tyler was sitting behind the steering wheel, his hands gripping it tightly at 10 and 2. The radio was crackling, playing this exact same song. John could almost feel the phantom warmth of his son sitting right there beside him, laughing as he struggled to shift the heavy gears. The memory was so vivid, so agonizingly real, that John let out a broken sob, burying his face in Martha's shoulder. Martha held him fiercely, rocking him back and forth, her own tears soaking the fabric of his embroidered work shirt. They were entirely broken, yet in that moment of profound musical communion, they were completely understood. All across the stadium, a spontaneous and breathtaking phenomenon began to occur. Without any prompting, without a single word of instruction, the tough working-class men and women of Texas responded the only way they knew how. Slowly, one by one, tiny lights began to pierce the suffocating darkness. Cell phone flashlights ignited, held high in the air by trembling hands. Within moments, the pitch-black arena was transformed into a dazzling galaxy of 80,000 makeshift stars, a silent, glowing vigil for Sergeant Tyler Hayes. The roughnecks from the oil fields, the ranchers with dirt permanently etched into their skin, the nurses, the mechanics, the teachers, they all stood shoulder to shoulder, united in a profound, collective grief. Men who had not cried in decades wept openly, holding their Stetsons tightly against their chests. As George reached the final verse, his voice dropped to a near whisper, carrying a haunting, intimate vulnerability. He strummed the final chord, letting the sound ring out, vibrating through the wood of the guitar and echoing off the concrete walls until it slowly, agonizingly faded into absolute silence. He kept his head bowed, his hand resting over the strings, letting the silence stretch out for what felt like an eternity. There was no immediate applause. The crowd was too stunned, too deeply moved to break the sanctity of the moment. Then slowly, starting from the upper decks and rolling down like a thunderstorm across the plains, the applause began. It was not the wild, screaming cheer of a concert encore. It was a slow, thunderous, rhythmic clapping. Everyone in the building rose to their feet. The standing ovation was deafening, a roaring wave of pure, unadulterated respect that shook the steel foundations of the building. There were no flashing strobe lights, no blasts of confetti, no grand fireworks display. The stage remained dark, illuminated only by the single spotlight on the cowboy and the single spotlight on the grieving parents. George unstrapped his guitar and carefully set it on the stage floor. He did not walk back to the microphone to say goodnight. He did not wave to the crowd. Instead, he stepped off the edge of the stage, walking down the heavy wooden stairs to the arena floor. The head of security, realizing what the singer intended to do, quickly signaled his team. The guards parted the sea of people, creating a clear, narrow path from the stage all the way to the stairs leading up to section 114. George walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his boots echoing on the concrete. The crowd parted respectfully, parting like the Red Sea, reaching out just to touch the sleeve of his shirt, offering whispered words of gratitude. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, John and Martha were already making their way down, guided by a gentle usher. They met on the flat concrete of the arena floor, surrounded by a circle of weeping fans and imposing security guards who were desperately trying to hide their own tears. The king of country music stopped in front of the mechanic from Midland. George took off his Stetson, holding it by his side, exposing his silver hair to the dim arena lights. He looked into John's bloodshot, devastated eyes and saw the mirror image of every hard-working father in America. There was no barrier of fame or fortune between them. They were just two men who understood the heavy burden of providing, protecting, and losing. George reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the crumpled, dirt-stained letter and the silver dog tags. He took John's large, calloused, grease-stained hand and gently placed the items into his palm, folding John's thick fingers over them. "He is riding with you tonight, John," George said softly. His voice meant only for the parents, "and he always will be. You raised a mighty fine man." John completely broke down. The stoic mechanic, a man who had spent his life fixing broken things, could not fix the shattered pieces of his own heart. He lunged forward, wrapping his massive arms around the singer. George did not hesitate. He embraced the grieving father fiercely, holding him tight as John sobbed into his shoulder. Martha wrapped her arms around both of them, burying her face against George's chest. For a long, suspended moment, the three of them stood locked together in the center of the arena, surrounded by the deafening, continuous roar of 80,000 people honoring a hero they had never met. The concert ended right there. There was no encore, no final upbeat song to send the crowd home dancing. The house lights slowly came up, and the audience filed out of the stadium in a hushed, reverent silence, the air thick with the realization that they had just witnessed something far greater than a musical performance. They had witnessed the very soul of their nation. In the days that followed, the world outside the stadium learned of what had transpired. Amateur videos recorded on shaky cell phones flooded the internet. The footage of the stoic cowboy stopping his massive production to read a letter from a fallen soldier spread like wildfire. It bypassed the usual trivial gossip of the media, dominating morning news broadcasts from the coastal cities to the deepest heartland. In a country that so often felt bitterly divided, arguing over politics and ideologies, the story of Sergeant Tyler Hayes and the quiet decency of George Strait became a sudden, powerful, unifying force. Millions of people watched the video, weeping at their desks, in their living rooms, and on their daily commutes. The impact of that single night rippled outward, creating a wave of tangible, life-changing action. George Strait's charitable foundation, which had always quietly supported military families, experienced an unprecedented, massive influx of donations. Working-class families, wealthy business owners, and anonymous donors poured millions of dollars into the fund. The money was dedicated entirely to Gold Star families, ensuring that the children of fallen soldiers would have their college tuitions paid in full, and that grieving widows and parents would not lose their homes to the crushing weight of sudden debt. John and Martha returned to their quiet life in Midland, but their home was no longer a silent tomb of despair. The crushing mountain of bills on their kitchen table was entirely wiped out by an anonymous donor, an act of grace arranged quietly by a man who wore a Stetson and believed in taking care of his neighbors. John went back to the mechanic shop, but he walked with his head held a little higher. He hung Tyler's dog tags from the rearview mirror of his old Ford pickup, and every time he turned the key and the engine roared to life, he felt the presence of his boy sitting right there in the passenger seat. As we reflect on the profound sacrifices made by those who serve, and the quiet, steadfast strength of the families who wait for them at home, I want to gently remind you that your support helps us continue to share these vital stories. If this journey touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, kindly leave a like on this video, and share it with those who value honor and decency. We would love to read your thoughts, so please leave a comment telling us which city you are watching from. Your presence in our community means the world to us, and we thank you for standing with us. The legacy of that night in Arlington was not measured in record sales or chart positions. It was measured in the restored dignity of a grieving family and the awakened conscience of a nation. It proved that the true fabric of society is not woven by the celebrities who demand the spotlight, but by the quiet, working-class men and women who raise heroes in their modest homes. It showed that true leadership is not about standing on a pedestal and demanding applause, but about having the humility to step down, kneel in the dust, and elevate the sacrifices of others. The stoic cowboy had reminded the world that fame is fleeting, but honor, respect, and the unconditional love of a family are the only things that truly endure the test of time.